Welcome to this video. Great to have you on board. In this video, I want to dive into alerts and modals. So we will have a look at how these work and not just how we can add them, which is really simple, but I'll explain this too, but also what happens behind the scenes and how Bootstrap makes sure that the things we see here look the way they look like. So let's dive right into that. Now this is the page or the state with which we finished in the last video. Now as I said in the teaser at the beginning, now it's time to add some modals and alerts. Now one important information here. This won't become a real complete website because I want to focus on the core Bootstrap features or some of its most important features. But if you like, we can always do another series where we add some backend, some server-side, some database, and build an entire project with that and with Bootstrap. So that might be a good alternative. So with that, let's just dive into modals and alerts and let's see how that works. And let's start with the alerts. Now, what is an alert to begin with? An alert simply is an element which you typically only display conditionally, be that because you're using a front-end framework like React or Angular or Vue and you render it upon a certain event, like a user entered some invalid data into a form, or you display it because you use a server-side framework to render your views, something like Express or Laravel and so on. And the user maybe also submitted a form or did something else where you want to show a message to him and want to inform the user about something. Then you would render that alert into your server-side rendered code and send back an HTML file with that alert in it. So hard coding an alert into a single HTML file, as we're doing it right now, is rarely what you do, but in the end the code you will use is the same. So let's just add an alert. In my HTML file, below the navigation, I will add an alert, and an alert is simply an element, a div, a block element, with a certain class. So let's add a div here, and on that div, I'll add a CSS class, and that CSS class is alert. Now we can enter some text between the opening and closing tags, like I'm an alert, and we should, for accessibility reasons, also add the role alert here to inform screen readers and so on what this element is about. With that, if we save that and we reload our page, we just see that text. Now, I don't know about you, but it's not that impressive. Though what we can see if we open the developer tools and we inspect this alert, we can see, let me expand this, the alert class here is already doing some work. It's adding some padding, some margin, and a border which is transparent. Now, what's the sense or the idea behind a transparent border? The idea is that we can now add an additional class to that alert div, which will simply set a special background and border color to give us an alert that looks a bit fancier. Now, why is the setup chosen like that? Because there's more than one way of displaying an alert. Sometimes you want to display an info message, which shouldn't look too aggressive, so you don't want to use a red or a yellow as a color there. Sometimes you want to display a warning, but not an error, so maybe you want to use yellow instead of red. And sometimes you need that normal alert, which is red. And sometimes you even want to display a success message. It's also called alert here, but it obviously should have some green color. That is why you simply add a second class to this div, and this now defines the kind of alert you want to show. And the class always has this pattern, alert dash, and then simply some special suffix which defines what it's like. You, for example, have primary. If you set this and you reload, you see we have this blue alert here. Now it takes the entire width of the page because by default this alert div occupies the entire width. Typically you would of course combine this with the grid. So you could add a container here and then you could add your row and in there your col class like that. And now if we add our alert in that class here, we still have a column, but due to the container, this is naturally centered and in the middle of everything. So if we now inspect this, we see here we got the row doing work, here we got the column doing work, and we got the container which centers this. So this is how you would normally do that. Of course, you can also add some spacing to the top. either due to some natural element which is added. For example, we could have another class here, another row, another column, and in there an h1 tag where I say alerts and modals. Ampersand, of course. So this is an example setup, but back to that alert. We added alert primary, and as you can see, this is blue. Now, we also can use alert secondary. If we do that, then we got the secondary base color Bootstrap defines, and that's this grayish color. So that's kind of a neutral message you might want to display sometimes. More interesting maybe are the special classes, like success. Now, as you might be able to guess, this gives us a green alert. So this is obviously a great choice if you want to show some success message to the user. Besides success, we also got danger, and danger will give the user a red alert. So this is what you want to use when form validation fails, something like this. We also have alert warning. This will give us a yellow alert, so that's interesting if you don't have an error yet, but you maybe want to notify the user of something, want to, well, give a warning to him. We also have info. This is again a bluish color, so it's actually the same color as primary had. If you have a look at the color codes there, and now we add primary again. If I reload, a slightly different color, I guess. So it's a different blue, but it's also blue. So primary or info would be the colors. Though important, the primary color uses the primary theme color, and you can actually override theme colors when you're building Bootstrap from source, so to say, when you embed it into your build workflow. Therefore, primary is not always blue. That's important to keep in mind. Now we also got light and dark. Light will have a white background, dark will have a grayish background. And this is how you can work with alerts. That's really the most important thing that's to them. Now you can also add two special things to alerts. One is links. You can add links. So maybe we add a link here. Click me. And let's have a look. This is a normal link leading nowhere in our case. If we save that and we reload, it looks like this, like a normal Bootstrap link with that bluish color. Now maybe you want to have a color that fits the alert you are having. And you can get that by adding a special class to that link. You can simply add alert-link as a class in there. With that, if you save that and reload, now you see it actually looks different. It now is a dark blue bold text. And if we change the alert to, let's say, success, you will see that this doesn't stay blue, but now it's dark green. So this adjusts the link to the alert type, which is very helpful, of course. Now, you can also use h1 and so on tags in there. You can, for example, add, let's say a h2 tag, and you can give this a special class alert heading. There you could say this is an alert, and then you could simply add a paragraph in here with no class. You don't need to add classes here to use them. And this will now give you a special heading, which also takes the color of the alert, and then a normal text. Now, important, you can, of course, use any HTML element in there. You can add lists in an alert if you want. You can add the margin helper classes Bootstrap offers. So everything you can use outside of an alert basically can be used in there too. Of course, you always have to test if it looks good and if it makes sense to be inside of an alert. Now, the last thing I want to show you is that you can configure Bootstrap or add something such that these alerts can automatically be dismissed. Now, you can, of course, always do that manually with your favorite JavaScript library or framework. But let's say you rendered this alert as part of a server-side rendered page, which is returned by your Express or Laravel application. In this case, you typically want to, or you might want to be able to remove the alert without adding a front-end framework, though that is possible too. Now, to make this dismissible, you first of all need to ensure that you're importing these scripts at the bottom. You need the Bootstrap JavaScript files. And then you need to add something to your alert. And that something, first of all, is a button, which allows you to remove the alert. So let's simply add a button here. Let's give it type button. And let's then simply add this cross in there, basically. So we can do this by adding a span and add the times character. And let's add aria hidden here to true to indicate that this won't be real content. Now, if we save that and we go back, we see that cross button here. Now, it doesn't look too beautiful, does it? Now, what we have to do is we have to add alert dismissible to our alert here. And to the button, you have to add a class to the close class. Now, if you do that and you reload, you see that the cross is here at the bottom. Now, this simply happens because the button, of course, is an inline element. We can position it at the top of our alert, though. And now it's here in the top right corner, which looks a lot better. Now, one thing you'll notice, though, is if you click that button, nothing happens. Because we haven't really connected this alert and this button to the Bootstrap JavaScript file. We do this by adding a special attribute to the button, the data-dismiss attribute. This will be automatically watched by the Bootstrap JavaScript file, and we can simply add alert as a value here, and this will then tell the Bootstrap JavaScript code essentially that whenever this is called, the alert will be removed. With that, if we now reload, now I can click this button and remove the alert. Now, as you see, it disappeared instantly. We can change this behavior by adding the fade show classes here to the overall alert. So next to alert and alert success, or whichever you have. And now it fades out, as you can see. So this is how you can make your alert dismissible without adding any custom JavaScript code. That were alerts. Let's now move on to modals. Now, what is a modal to begin with? A modal is this pop-up-like window which does not open a separate browser window, but which simply renders in front of your other content on your page. Now, let's add such a modal to our page. I'll add it in front of my grid here. It will be an overlay anyways. And how do we add a modal? Well, we simply add a div. That's always a good start when using Bootstrap, I guess. And then we need to assign the modal class to that div. Now, next, we can define some content inside of that div. We can also add some accessibility values here. You can always find them in the detailed Bootstrap documentation you find linked in the video description or below this video to be precise. So, inside that modal div, we now have to define the content of that modal. And for that, it turns out that we actually need another wrapping div for the positioning Bootstrap does behind the scenes, and that should be modal-dialog. Modal-dialog now takes the different modal components we have. To be precise, it takes yet another wrapper needed for the padding inside the modal, which is modal-content. Now we can finally start adding content. For example, we can add a modal header. Now, a modal header is optional. You don't have to add one. It allows you to provide a caption, a title for your modal, and also a close button. But you can close the modal differently too. So here is the modal header. Now let's add a h2 tag in there where we can say, please confirm. And this h2 tag should also receive a class, the modal-title class, which will style this in a nice way. Now we can add a button here, as I said, which allows us to close the modal. It will again hold a span with that times character, so with this cross character we saw before. This button is of type button, and it will receive the close class, just as you saw in the alert. It basically is the same button we had here. Now with that, we got a title here. Now if we save everything and we reload, we don't see a modal. Well, we'll come back to that in a second. This is our modal header. Now, before we try seeing that, let's also add a modal body. Now, you always should have a modal body. That is the core content you display. And in there, you can use the Bootstrap grid. You can construct a form. You can do whatever you want. Here, I'll simply add a paragraph where I say, this is the modal body. Do you like it? And to allow the user to give us an answer, we can also add a modal footer, which is optional again. Now in that modal footer, we could add more buttons, and these buttons could also be used to send data to the server and close the modal, just close the modal in case of a cancel button, stuff like that. Now, actually, I'll dive deeper into buttons and forms in the next video in this series. But for now, let's simply add a basic button. Let's add a confirm button here. It's the only button we'll have, let's say. And that will also receive type button, which, by the way, is never required for this to work, just semantically required or makes sense. And let's give it a class of btn and then btn secondary maybe. Now with that, we got a basic modal. Again, more on buttons in the next video. Now, we still can't see it. If I reload it, there's no modal. The reason for this is that the modal by default isn't visible. It typically is shown upon a certain action. Now, how do we show it? We need JavaScript for that. And you can always add the classes that will show it manually. We'll inspect the modal to see which these are. But for now, let's simply add a button to show it. So in my grid, and I just recognized I am inside my grid, so let's add that modal outside of the grid container. It would work otherwise too, but it doesn't really make sense semantically. So let me get out of the grid. And in that grid, I'll now add a new row and a new column. And in that column, I'll simply add another button. And for that button, I'll say show modal. Now to show that, first of all, let's give it type button 2. Now let's also give it some button classes, button primary maybe, to give this some nice styling. Now to show the modal, I'll add another data attribute, data toggle. And here I will say modal. This also is automatically picked up by Bootstrap's JavaScript code, and it will recognize that when we click this button, we want to show a modal. However, we also need to be clear about which modal. And for that, we'll give our modal an ID. So here on that div element, which has the class modal, I'll also add an ID. And you can set up any ID you want, like demo modal. Again, you're totally free to choose whichever ID you want. Now take that ID and go down to your show modal button there. And on that button, you now add data-target. This is required by Bootstrap's JavaScript code to understand which modal you want to show or hide. So now we simply add that ID here with a hashtag in front of it because we actually passed the full CSS selector. And now we can reload. We see that button, and if we click it, we see our modal. And this is how it looks like. Now, if we click that button here, nothing happens. If we click that cross, nothing happens. If we click the backdrop, it closes though. So that's a default behavior. Clicking the backdrop removes the modal. Now, before we make these buttons work, let's quickly inspect this modal. Here's our modal class, or our modal div. You see the modal div actually wraps or spans the entire size of your page, which makes sense. You want to have it on your entire page. Now there, on that modal div, you can also see that we got a show class. Now, we didn't add that. If you inspect the modal in our code, there's just a modal class, no show class. This is actually the class which is added when we run that JavaScript code, when we click that button. Now, this show class is part of what shows this modal, besides the display block property. If I uncheck display block and I remove the show class and set display to none here, therefore, not just remove it, set it to none, then the modal is gone. And this is what you can do with your own JavaScript code too, in case you don't want to use Bootstrap's JavaScript package. You can add this class and set this style with Vue, React, Angular, whatever you're using, or vanilla JavaScript. Now the modal is still there, as you can tell. Now this is this modal backdrop div, which was added automatically by the JavaScript code we executed, because we didn't add this here. We don't have that class here. So you will have to add a div with a class modal backdrop and show manually too, just in case you want to rebuild this without using the Bootstrap JavaScript package. With that, let's reload the page and open it again though. Would be nice if these close buttons would work. Now again, you could use your own JavaScript implementation to manually set display to none and remove the show class and remove the backdrop. But of course, we can also make these buttons work. And we do so by going to these buttons, and on the button, we simply add something. Here on our modal, we simply add data dismiss again to our button. And this time we specify modal as a value here. Before we specified alert to close an alert, now we want to close a modal. And by the way, you can only have one modal at a time. Multiple nested modals are not supported. So with that, we added this dismiss trigger to, well, dismiss any modal or dem modal we have. Let's also add the same for the button in the footer. And now if we reload, you see if I click these buttons, we close the modal. And again, this could be done with your own JavaScript too. That is how the Bootstrap modal works in its core. Now, in the official docs, you'll learn more about what you can put inside of a modal, that you got alternative classes if you need a bigger or smaller modal, that you can also create a modal with scrolling content. It will scroll automatically then, and that you can vertically center a modal. Now, one thing I want to show you right away now is if we click that, the modal just pops up. It's there. Yeah? It doesn't animate in. And it would be nice if it would. And actually, that is a simple default behavior you can add with just the addition of one class. On our modal here, besides just adding modal, you can also add fade. And this will make sure that the modal fades in. With that added, if we reload, now you see it slides down and fades in. And it also is removed like that. This certainly looks nicer and therefore is something you should consider adding to any modal you display. That's actually it for modals. I hope this was helpful. For modals and alerts, I should say. I hope this was helpful and allows you to add these features to your next project. In the next video of this series, we'll dive into forms and buttons and see what we can do with these. See you there, hopefully. Bye.